All right. Perfect. So I think we are ready to start. So first of all, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Susie Wrighton, and I'm the sector lead for cybersecurity at the Israel Trade and Economic Mission to the UK. First of all, I'd like to thank you for joining us today on this Trilateral Cyber panel on post-pandemic healthcare, which will specifically focus on the primary role of cybersecurity. So as we know, the healthcare sector across countries is under heavy pressure, and now more than ever, it's proving to be a critical asset which deserves all the support. And that's why we thought that initiating this conversation would hopefully lead to more dialogues and cooperation, not only between regulators and CISOs, between public and private sector, but also between specialists across countries. And for these reasons, we decided to partner with the Israel Trade and Economic Mission to Washington, DC, and specifically with our colleague Josh Cohen, who's the Director of Cybersecurity, with the aim to deliver a panel that will bring together 6 speakers, regulatory experts and CISOs from Israel, US, and the UK that will share with us their point of view on the policies and operational changes that they're facing as the surge in cyber threats endangers both the operations of hospital, testing labs, vaccine supply chain, but ultimately patient data and safety. And to do so, I'd like to introduce you to the moderator for today, Ofer Forer. He's the Minister and Head of the Israel Trade and Economic Mission in the UK. And as a last word, I would like to remind you that this session will be recorded, and I'd like to encourage you to share your question on the Q&A chat, and we will try to address them towards the end of the session. Once again, thank you, and Ofer, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Susie, for the intro, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our audience from the United States, United Kingdom, and Israel. As the seminar, not to hear another set of challenges of specific country, but to hear high-level and also vivid discussion among healthcare cyber experts from 3 unique healthcare systems around the world, as well as leading nations in cybersecurity. There's no need to explain why is healthcare cybersecurity important and which are the threats. The dynamics of past ransomware attacks coupled with the vulnerability of healthcare supply chains and laboratories are clear in today's COVID world. In order to discuss what needs to be done to minimize the threat and what are the challenges and solutions for doing so, we brought together an impressive list of experts from the policy side, as well as experts from the implementation and operations side. I would now like our panelists to shortly introduce themselves and their respective organization. Let's start with our panelists from the United States. Laura Hoffman, please shortly introduce yourself.
Hi there, good morning from the East Coast of the US, and good afternoon and evening to others watching. My name is Laura Hoffman. I am Assistant Director of Federal Affairs with the American Medical Association. And the American Medical Association essentially is the nation's largest association representing physicians. But our mission is essentially the betterment of health and of public health. So we do our best to represent the interests not only of our physician members, but also of patients throughout the country. My role specifically is with policy on the federal side, so interacting very often with the federal agencies such as the Department of Health and Human Services. I focus mostly on health IT policy, a couple other issues here and there, but I'm really honored to be here with all of you today, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. We're staying in the East Coast United States, moving to Anais Santiago. Please shortly introduce yourself.
Well, hello from very snowy Philadelphia right now. I'm Anais Santiago. I am the Chief Information Security Officer for Christiana Care. Christiana Care is the largest health system in Delaware, also serving the 3 neighboring states of Jersey, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. In terms of size, we are I think we're 24th largest in terms of admission across the country, and are an integrated health system with physician practices, freestanding emergency rooms, urgent care centers, hospitals, you name it. And we're also the single level 1 trauma center between Philadelphia and Baltimore.
Thank you, Anai. We will move eastbound across the Atlantic to the United Kingdom. I would like to ask Neil Bennett to present himself.
Hello there. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. So I'm Neil Bennett. I'm CISA NHS Digital. So for those of you who aren't familiar with NHS Digital, we are essentially the technology, digital and data delivery arm of the Department of Health within England. So where it makes sense to deliver national scale technology, digital or data services on behalf of Department of Health and deploy across the NHS, we tend to be the partner of choice to do that. And that can range from a variety of infrastructure services, underpinning infrastructure services, through to clinical services in use right across the NHS, patient-facing services, and more moving into that kind of patient-facing NHS app, putting data in the hands of the patient themselves, through to increased use of data to improve health outcomes. And my role essentially covers within NHS Digital both kind of physical personnel, technical and cyber security for NHS Digital as an organisation, but we also deliver cybersecurity services and support right across the NHS as a whole.
Thank you, Neil. Staying in United Kingdom, I would like to introduce David Nightcroft. David, can you shortly introduce yourself?
Thanks very much, Hoffa. My name is David Nightcroft. I'm head of cybersecurity policy at NHSX. NHSX is a joint unit between the UK's Department of Health and NHS England. And our role is to drive forward digital transformation of health and social care. And if you're thinking that sounds very similar to what Neil's organisation does, we obviously work very closely with NHS Digital, who are our delivery partners. We set the strategy, we set standards, and act as a regulatory function in some areas, and leave all the heavy lifting and hard work to our partners at NHS Digital and Neil.
Thank you, David. Moving eastbound across the Mediterranean to Israel, Yaniv Paz, could you please shortly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ofer. My name is Yaniv Paz. I'm the head of cybersecurity guidance unit in Israel Ministry of Health. Our support is to guide and train and practice all the teams, whether both government and non-government organization. The main goals are to promote cybersecurity, to define the regulation, the correct regulation, not to overlap on the regulation, but in order to support the organization. Mainly focusing on safety between the organization itself and the healthcare sector in Israel. Many activities, deploying medical device, deploying SCADA units, as well as IT, traditional IT. Thank you.
Thank you, Yaniv. Staying in Israel and moving to the operations side. Tamir Ronen, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Tamir Ronen. I'm the Chief Information Security of Asuta Medical Centers. Asuta Medical Center is the largest private hospital network in Israel, operating 8 hospitals and medical centers from north to south. Asuta takes care of the health of more than 1 million patients per year. We have thousands of medical devices, and most of them are connected to our IT network. We are working with many cutting-edge products and startup companies, including IT and cybersecurity. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamir, and thank you all for doing it quickly. It might be a bit problematic of trying to take all the information of what we do and push it into 1 minute, but we've definitely made it. So now that we are a bit more familiar with the panelists and their respective organizations, I would like to address our first question to our operations side speakers, Neil, Anahi, and Tamir. Please share with us your view on how has the COVID pandemic changed the landscape of healthcare cyber threats, and which challenges are accelerated in the post-COVID era from your point of view?
You want me to start?
Since you asked.
Okay. So first of all, we had to think to how to treat patients remotely, which wasn't an issue before the COVID-19. We had to implement in no time telemedicine technologies. Telemedicine technology were on our roadmap, but the pandemic accelerated in terms of budget and priorities. Many more employees worked remotely and we had to support them 24/7. There are more attempts to send sensitive information out of the organization. We receive 5 times more phishing emails than the average. And there are many more attempts to receive sensitive clinical information by external parties regarding the COVID-19 virus.
And I think those challenges are absolutely consistent with what we've seen in the UK in terms of that kind of threat surface and the at which those remote consultations have been required. I mean, it's been positive from one perspective in terms of increasing the pace of digitalization of healthcare services, but then equally the pace at which those services have been rolled out and deployed, trying to keep pace with that delivery and increased delivery from a security perspective has certainly been a challenge for us within our organisation. So NHS Digital has been a partner of the Department of Health, NHSX, in delivering much of the test and trace infrastructure to support the COVID response, and more recently the vaccinations infrastructure. So that has resulted in multiple new or significantly changed services being spun up at probably a greater pace than ever before. So trying to get that kind of risk balance from a security perspective, support the pace and the need to get those services out there against the increased threat landscape, and trying to get that risk decision to get the right level of security input and secure those services has certainly been a challenge that we've been grappling with over recent months.
Anai, what are your take on the outcome of COVID from your point of view?
Yes, so very, very similar and consistent with what has already been shared in terms of, you know, the sheer pace of being able to support the magnitude and the speed to implement virtual care and remote work. I think the fortunate thing for us is we had the infrastructure in place in order to we had already had a mantra of enabling our caregivers to have access to our systems from anywhere at any time from any device. So the infrastructure to support that was already in place. So the move to remote work wasn't significantly burdensome. And we already had contracts with Zoom for healthcare, the business associate agreements, the infrastructure. So to facilitate virtual care was also not a major issue. But now we've started looking at home health delivery, all of the devices that would support enablement of patients to be able to self-manage their care while at home through support virtually. And so we've had to not only maintain business as usual from a cybersecurity perspective, but also pick up the pace on the assessment of all of these third parties, mostly startups with really valuable healthcare delivery mechanisms, but not necessarily very mature information security programs. And so really working with our clinicians, the business, and these third parties to figure out what that balance is from a risk perspective on the value that they're delivering from a care perspective, but the risk that we're introducing into our organization because they're cybersecurity programs are not as mature. And then of course, the threat landscape has been elevated, and healthcare is a target for all of the reasons that we can acknowledge, in terms of we're at a point where our systems are super stressed. And the last thing we can deal with right now is to manage a cybersecurity attack, whether it's denial of service or ransomware. So I do believe that threat actors recognize that we're going to be far more apt to cave in to potential demands, because we've got to get back to delivering care at a speed that we're almost not used to delivering in. So as cybersecurity professionals, I think our primary goal is always to enable the business and our caregivers, and the pace, the sheer pace that we're being asked to function has elevated immensely. But it's also a really exciting time. I mean, if this last year coming to work and knowing that the impact of our cybersecurity team on everything that's going on across the country has made it that much more meaningful to be a CISO.
I agree with you, Anani. These are definitely exciting times, and as Tamir mentioned, the magnitude of phishing attacks or the digitalization puts a lot of efforts on our system, and that reminds me a theory in history that says that the main drive for acceleration of technology is war. For example, in the beginning of World War I, aviation was not as technologically advanced as at the end of World War I. We are not right now in actual war, but we are in a war against COVID. And this really accelerates the digitalization, as Neil mentioned, and of course also the threats. And that actually connects me to the second question, which it's more policy oriented. So I would like to advise our policy side speakers to be more involved in that, David, Laura, and Yaniv. The question is that given the dramatic transformation in cyber healthcare arena, as we just seen, can you share your main objectives from a regulatory standpoint in the post-COVID era? For example, what are the gaps which are emerging these days, and how do you plan to mitigate them?
Shall I jump on that first? Thanks, Alpha. I mean, I would say that actually our priorities are exactly the same as they were before, only the context is completely different, to be honest with you. I mean, we've heard about how the stakes have been raised, both in terms of the pace of and demand that's being put on health services. But this is also put across a really important message, I think, in that cyber resilience isn't just about securing, national defense and so on. It's about securing services for citizens, and it really is a matter of life and death in a pandemic. And looking beyond the pandemic, obviously we have the challenges which we've heard from operational colleagues in that we've got an increased attack surface through remote working and so on, and we've got a slightly different threat and vaccine supply chains and so on. But it's still it's about getting the basics right, having support to those organizations to make sure they can get the basics right. So patching and moving off unsupported systems, antivirus, firewalls. All of those things, and you asked, what are the gaps? And I think for us and the journey that we've been on in England over the last few years, understanding where our gaps are has been kind of key to calibrating our response. We've moved from a place where we were, first of all, we tried to offer enabling services that organizations could reach out and use themselves, knowing their own cybersecurity problems. Then we realized they don't know their own cybersecurity problems. Then we moved to a model where we were able to collect some data, and then we were able to essentially procure solutions and locally deliver them, which helped organizations. But now in the the COVID era, we're now where the stakes are much higher and the pressure on organizations are constant. We're reaching down and directly identifying problems and fixing them, and that's giving us a new stream of data, which is allowing us to identify new gaps. And I think one of the key things going forward is going to be able to maintain those data streams, because if you can measure problem, then you can begin to manage it and set standards around it, which we expect people to keep. And I think the trick is in with all this pressure is getting the right mixture between carrot and stick, because everyone is under an awful lot of pressure to deliver, and cybersecurity is probably the last thing they want to think about.
Completely agree. Basically, during the last year, we have very innovation and get into, side effect of the pandemic is to adapt the technology very fast. This is the main reason that security, is the last one that encounter. First, we want to adapt it, but we need to have correct processes in order to make it safety for the patient at the end. I think that the urgency, it's something that we need to consider as a positive issue, because we are going to change the era that we had before is going to be completely different with new technology that getting into healthcare sector, including application, cloud-based security that involve the parameter is different than what we used to have. Connectivity, the actual care is done at home. Part of the treatment is not being in the hospital or in the clinic itself. This is something that we need to consider. Part of the privacy issue, part of the denial of service, and the impact of the patient itself. We needed to adapt a lot of medical devices that need to be regulated, and including application that we needed to have a different code, and we need to do kind of reverse coding in order to make it safe. And the main gap that we want to achieve right now that quickly close the activities that we have better management on hospitals and even healthcare sector, the complete health sector. Previously, we had only the government hospitals that were giving numbers of asset inventory. Right now, we have better picture on what we have in the healthcare sector at all. And this is kind of the pandemic, like you mentioned, Ofer, that the war is putting you in a pressure, and that you create things that innovate and put it in a constraint that we are in a position that all the activities are done in order to see the future. And the future is different than what we used to it. Basically, I think that most of the labs that we have a lot of activities of clarify and test lab, and all the needs for a supply chain in order to get more involved and more activities. This is something that we are going to keep, and it's going to change the picture that we are used to. So all the security from the side of supply chain is something that we are used to have, kind of regulation. This is the way you're connecting to us. This is the way all the process right now is outside of the hospital. It's not in the hospital, and you need to have kind of activities in order to make it safe. Thank you.
I'd say from the US side, there are a few things that we're thinking about. First of all, in terms of policy, when the public health emergency began, and that's kind of a formal declaration by the federal government of reflecting the pandemic, some of our agencies have issued certain waivers of longstanding law. One example is from the agency, the Office for Civil Rights, which enforces our health sector privacy law called HIPAA. And one thing that they did was said that for the duration of the public health emergency, we are not going to enforce violations of HIPAA for use of telehealth. As the other, operational side panelists have noted, clearly there was a huge spike in telehealth when the public health emergency started. And particularly for small practices, physicians in small and medium-sized practices who aren't practicing in hospital or large healthcare systems, a lot of their work, essentially moved to home just like the rest of ours did. So we've had to provide them with guidance throughout about how to secure those home networks, because they may be starting from scratch trying to ensure that they can replicate some of the same cyber hygiene they had in place in their office setting, now in their home, where they could be sharing networks with the rest of their family and who knows who else. So that was kind of a big gap that we had to address initially, getting folks used to working from home and securing their networks. As this waiver goes on, part of what is waived under HIPAA are things like conducting business associate agreement or implementing business associate agreements, or conducting security risk analyses to ensure that vulnerabilities are identified and mitigated. And so while this was a good effort by the federal government to get folks using telehealth more rapidly once the public health emergency began, as time goes on, and particularly given the high incidence of cyber attacks that the US is experiencing right now in healthcare, we are trying to really communicate to our physician members and to clinicians across the country that even if there is some enforcement discretion with some of these legal requirements right now, they really should be thinking about getting into business associate agreements and conducting security risk analyses. And for those not familiar with the US law around that, essentially those actions are taken to try to ensure that whoever has access to the health data that they are collecting, storing, and exchanging abide by the appropriate security and privacy protections. So we're trying to tell folks that even if you aren't legally required to be doing some of these things right now, it's really imperative that you take steps to start doing them anyway, so that you're protecting that information. So that's one thing that, particularly when the public health emergency ends, could be a gap that we will need to address quickly to ensure that the telehealth platforms that were adopted during this time are brought up to speed with the kind of long-standing baseline security and privacy regulations in the US. So that's one thing.
Thank you, Laura, and also Yaniv and David for sharing your insights. I would like to touch base on one of the areas which was also discussed, which is ransomware. So Neil and Nahi, please share with us how COVID changed the danger of ransomware, and from your point of view, what are the steps that should be taken to mitigate the danger?
So as I mentioned in my earlier response, the stressors of the healthcare systems are undergoing right now present a ripe opportunity for threat actors to launch attacks, because there's a greater propensity to want to pay and get back to resumption of business. And we certainly in the US has seen an immense increase in ransomware attacks. Even some of the threat actors that and ransomware groups that originally stated that they weren't going to go after healthcare, very quickly pivoted and started launching attacks on healthcare. And not only did they, increase the rapid deployment of ransomware, but they also started doing data exfiltration prior to launching those ransomware attacks. So they gave healthcare organizations a 1-2 punch. And what I read late last year is that now, if those negotiations aren't going well, they're launching denial of service attacks against the organization. So now it's a 1-2-3 punch. And I think that's an indication that that the attacks against healthcare aren't going to subside. There was a joint alert between the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and Health and Human Services in October, late October, of an imminent attack against healthcare organizations, upwards of 400 for ransomware attacks. And so I think that the industry went on high alert because of that, and to some degree, I think thwarted some of those attacks because we became so vigilant. So to answer that second part of the question around what should organizations be doing, is remain vigilant. These attacks aren't going to subside, and we do believe that in 2021, there's still a lot of opportunity for threat actors to go after healthcare. And that vigilance, it can be done in terms of consuming threat intelligence, sharing threat intelligence, so being a member of an organization like HISAC, which is an information sharing organization in the healthcare industry, and that organization is now international. It used to be NHISAC because it was focused on the US, but there are lots of efforts by that organization to span internationally so that we can start doing information sharing across nations, just not domestically. They're investing in technology in order to have defense in depth, can also help with thwarting ransomware attacks, and obviously the basics around cybersecurity hygiene, which is making sure that you're doing patch management, that you're doing vulnerability management, that you're keeping pace with alerts that are coming out in terms of vulnerabilities and being speedy in order to mitigate those. And lastly, educate, which has become a challenge now that we've moved to remote work. Because although we can still do those phishing attacks and we can still do the forced annual training and the regular security updates that can reach all of our caregivers, what we have lost are those hallway conversations that took place before or after a meeting or in the cafeteria. And so a lot of that informal dialogue that really did have an effect on overall awareness have gone by the wayside. And so to me, those are the concerns around how we still reach our caregivers, those thousands of folks that are no longer receiving that informal communication has been an area of focus for the last year for me, because I think it will have an effect if we can be successful in thwarting all of the threats that are facing healthcare organizations right now.
Thank you, Anai. I must admit that with these phishing tests is something that we've been doing also on the governmental level, and I became the master of finding these phishing emails. So education does work. It's not the same as having people in the office, and I agree with you that there's something missing about this coffee corner conversation, not only from the social point of view, but also from the professional point of view. But I'll be very happy now to hear Neil's point on ransomware and how, from the NHS point of view, he thinks that this danger should be mitigated. Please, Neil.
It was a fairly comprehensive response from Anahi there. I guess the ransomware danger is not new. It's just been significantly magnified by our current context, and at the end of the day, it's a patient safety risk. It's a patient safety issue at the end of the day, and that's what's kind of always at the forefront of our minds. Just picking up on the point around the kind of hack and leak, the exfiltration and the threat of leaking that data. Not only is that a kind of immediate consideration and concern in current context, but we also need to think about that from the more strategic perspective and potential impacts on the digitization agenda. So leaking of healthcare data can undermine public confidence in what we're trying to do with the digitization agenda. So that whole kind of hack and leak approach that we're seeing a significant rise in at the moment is absolutely something that can have broader, longer term strategic impacts on that agenda. But just picking up on the mitigation steps, I guess, just to add to the earlier points, I think also almost assume that you will get compromised and have your reactive approach in place also. So, robust backup approach, ensure that you're backing up regularly, ensure that you're testing the restore of those backups, those sorts of considerations, but also your incident response plans. So if you assume that you will get compromised, ensure that you've got the response plans, ensure you're testing those response plans, broader business continuity plans, so that if there are operational impacts, those broader business continuity plans are in place. So it's very much defense in depth, as the statement was used. It's the proactive activities to try to guard against and prevent the attack in the first place, but then also on the flip side of that, the more reactive considerations: assume that you will get attacked, assume that you will get compromised, and make sure that you're in good shape to be able to deal with that if and when it does happen.
Thank you, Neil. Well, you mentioned the patient health as the main goal, and there is. It reminds me of the tragedy last year in September in Germany, where there was an actual fatality of a patient due to ransomware attacks. And this leads me to a bounce back question to our group of regulators. This is for David, Laura, and Yaniv. From your perspective as a regulator, what is your strategy going to be to secure data for increasing number of ransomware attacks?
So I'm going to build on what Neil was saying there. I mean, as you might imagine, probably there's not a lot of difference in our positions, because we work very closely on this. But also building on Laura's point, I recognise what you're saying about HIPAA, about not enforcing infringements of HIPAA in some instances, and there being a degree of security debt there. That is a problem as we're moving out of COVID. So when I say that what I said before is that we need to get the basics right, and what others have said, and that needs to be our strategy in dealing with ransomware. We need to encourage organisations to have appropriate, AV and firewalls and supported systems. I recognise that that's difficult in the context of security debt and moving out of COVID. But as Neil says, we've had a really big focus on making sure that organisations have got appropriate backups in place for when, not if, the inevitable does happen, and having appropriate business continuity plans. And then we, as a kind of national strategy, we have a wraparound sort of level of central monitoring and support services. So we have a cybersecurity operations centre, and we have monitoring through Microsoft Advanced Threat Protection across the NHS estate, Secure Boundary, which is an NHS-wide firewall system. So it's trying to catch ransomware before it hits us, but planning for when it does hit us, that we'll be in a decent place to be able to recover from it.
Thank you, David. Laura, what's your take on data security?
So there are a couple things I'll mention that are actually fairly new developments in US law that I think will be important for the policy folks to be thinking about in the coming year. One is that, as I mentioned, in the US, probably in many other places around the world, we have different types of provider settings. So there are large health systems like Christiana, and there are one or two physician practices, doctor size practices. So there's huge variation in what people know about cybersecurity and the kinds of resources they have available to help shore up their cyber hygiene. Typically, those smaller, one or two doc practices do not have people devoted full-time to security, might not have the financial resources to obtain the latest and greatest software and hardware that can help them with their cyber hygiene. But late last year, we had some new law enacted that essentially permits the sharing or donation of cybersecurity resources and tools. For example, a hospital could share certain types of hardware, software, expertise with community practices in their region. And oftentimes, and this is good, because oftentimes some of these smaller practices may be hosted their EHRs may be hosted by the larger health system. So that larger health system has kind of expanded endpoints. And you want to make sure that all of those endpoints are obviously secured. So anyway, what this new law will do, these new regulations will do, is hopefully better enable some of the practices throughout the country that have been lacking up-to-date, modern, really robust cyber protection, and get some of those resources into those practices' hands. So we're going to be trying to talk to our members about how they can work with their larger health systems to try to obtain some of that information, how they can maybe set up office hours with experts in the field, CISOs in their communities to learn more about the threats that are emerging or that they may be facing in the future. So that's one thing that we really want to make sure that folks are aware of and they take advantage of to try to build up their defenses. And the second thing I'll mention is in this past, just at the end of last year, is a new law that essentially, I'm going to refer back to HIPAA now. When people violate HIPAA, the Office of Civil Rights comes in and investigates, and that may lead to fines or settlement arrangements, etc. One thing that the AMA and other stakeholders have been really encouraging is to say, hey, let's create some positive incentives here for clinicians to adopt good cyber hygiene. Let's not make it all about punishment. Let's give them a reason to do it proactively instead of just reacting when threats occur. So Congress listened, and we now have a law that says essentially if practices adopt recognized security practices, that will be taken into consideration if there is a breach or if there is an attack, and OCR comes in and investigates these security practices. So now the work begins of making sure that practices are aware of what recognized security practices are. A great tool that is available is something that came out through the Health Sector Coordinating Council Cybersecurity Working Group, which is kind of a joint public-private partnership focused solely on cybersecurity. And they developed some really great resources for practices of all sizes, not just aimed at the really tech-savvy CISOs and large systems, but things that again, one or two doc practices can understand and adopt. So we're really going to want to try to talk to our providers across the country, make sure that they're taking steps to adopt these recognized security practices, and hopefully that'll have benefit for everybody. It'll prevent the docs from being from encountering this harsher security enforcement if anything does go wrong, but also, again, be proactive, encourage communication within the community, get some of these kinds of steps in place, hopefully before the attacks happen, so that they're ready, again, as others have said, when it happens, not if it happens. So we'll be working on that this year for sure.
Thank you, Laura. This is a very interesting discussion. As a regulator, should you put more focus on the stick or the carrots? And I do believe in positive regulation, not on negative regulation, but it's still regulation. I want to echo one of the topics that you mentioned, which is being the enabler of information sharing. And I would like to move this question in our virtual microphone to Yaniv. Please share with us, Yaniv, from the Ministry of Health in Israel, how do you enable information sharing among the healthcare organizations in Israel?
One reference offer with your permission regarding what Laura mentioned, I think that WannaCry was a kind of a wake-up call to everyone in terms of ransom. Basically, what we are seeing that regulation are taking place, and it's more important that we will have regulated. In Israel, we have Israeli law, and it's equivalent to GDPR that everyone familiar with. Most of the organizations are comply with GDPR as well as ISO. But in order to give a good fight on ransom, you need to have technology, and technology costs money. we know that we have differentiality between organization, and we have organizations that are having the technology in place, like a team client, like a isolated backup or DRs, and others that don't have. But in terms of maturity level, we need to see how we are targeting in order to have safety. As you mentioned, the part of the ransom is to have safety of the treatment itself. So in terms of what will be the impact, I think that the invest of the money should go accordingly. Okay. In what you mentioned regarding sharing information, basically our unit was established in 2016, and the goal was to share the information, share knowledge, share the intelligence, give guidelines, and do proactive action like penetration testing to organization. Since we are a government unit, we are not costing money, so it's kind of a benefit, but we have a commitment from the organization to use, whether it's technology-based or to have what we are finding is impact vulnerabilities, they need to fix in a proper time. So it's a kind of, from one side we are providing services, but we are asking from the other end to take actions. So what we are sharing actually is we share, we will mention the supply chain, maybe we'll elaborate in a few seconds, but you mentioned that we have providers that are equal and using in different variety of hospitals. And there is no point of each and every one to do all the activity, because afterwards you are not achieving anything. Maybe you will find 2 or 3 organization, supply chain organizations provider during 1 year. And you are not able to achieve the entire scope of thousands of suppliers. So what we did, we put grade on the impact, and according to the impact, we share the information between organizations. And we did kind of controls and put safeguard in place in order to have better security for the long term.
Thank you, Yaniv. Moving onwards, another key source of vulnerabilities raised by our panelists was medical IoT. I would like to ask the next question to David and Neil. How do you evaluate and assess the needs on regulation when it comes to IoT security? And specifically, is there a dialogue with the industry in this matter?
Shall I start off on that one, Neil, and then I'll pass all the hard bits to you. How about that?
Okay, fine.
Well, look, it might be worthwhile defining the problem about what is the problem with IoT, because it's a hot topic, so clearly it is a problem. People always want to talk about it. A lot of medical devices have really long lifespans. Perhaps their diagnostic equipment, they've got lifespans of decades. Their operating systems may go out of support. They are, so you can't patch them, and even when you can patch them, it's still difficult to patch them anyway, because they might be locked down by the supplier, or because the diagnostic devices, they need to be clinically verified for every patch to make sure that nothing's gone wrong which might affect patient harm. And all of this is assuming that organizations have a perfect grasp of their medical device estate. I think it was Yaniv earlier who was talking about the importance of asset management. I think that's true across the estate, but particularly in medical devices, our experience is that organizations often don't have an overview of their devices. But just to also say what the problem isn't, as we see it, the threat here isn't that medical devices are going to be hacked and used to kill people. The problem is that medical devices are points of weakness in your cybersecurity armor, and maybe a way for an attacker to gain a foothold on the on a network. That's the problem as I see it as a policy professional, and probably the engagement with suppliers is key. The answers are probably not easy. Neil is leading a lot of our work on this, so I will pass it over to him to nuance all the things that I've said.
Thanks, David. So I guess, as David's touched on there, we've actually just, in order to drive forward this agenda and get the right people in the room, we've established a connected medical devices cybersecurity steering group. The approach that we're taking there, we've got the medicines and healthcare regulatory agency in England as co-chair with NHS Digital. NHSX are also a significant seat at that table, and we're also bringing in supplier community, industry, and looking at bringing in some of our NHS trusts, hospital trusts. So we've got that right representation across the user community, supplier community, national bodies and the regulatory bodies to look at how we can work closer together and work better together to drive forward that agenda of security of connected medical devices and try to address some of the challenges that David's touched on there, both from doing more centrally, but also equipping local organisations with the right tools, better tools to be able to manage that risk at a local level. And there's a couple of regulatory opportunities that we have there from a broader kind of consumer devices perspective, IoT perspective. The Department of Media, Culture and Sport in the UK are currently looking at a smart bill, which is looking at consumer IoT and raising the standard, the regulation for devices there. So we've got an opportunity to be able to, I guess, focus on the overlap between consumer IoT, wearables and such like, where there's that overlap between medical devices and consumer IoT. So we've got an opportunity coming up there from a regulatory perspective, but then on a slightly longer burn, an opportunity to drive the agenda for our medical devices regulation, which is probably a couple of years out. And that's very much a goal of that steering group. It's to both look at the shorter term and better equip local organisations, but also that longer term strategic view of how we could better influence and better input into that medical devices regulation in a couple of years' time.
Thank you, Neil and David, for sharing the UK perspective. I would like just to see the Israeli perspective from the operational point of view. Tamir, how do you refer to the threat of IoT cybersecurity in your organization?
So first of all, like David says, there is a lack of visibility. The traditional solutions provide minimum information about medical devices, such as IP addresses. Most of the traditional solutions cannot provide useful information about the identity of the IoT, its version, security, vulnerabilities, and communication between devices. In addition, every medical institute needs to have a live inventory of the medical and IoT devices that shows you the overall risk assessment of connecting them to the IT network.
Exactly, but it's just that.
You need to implement a dedicated solution regarding the IoT device. There are several good solutions on the market. We are using one of the leading startups in that area. And another thing, it's very important to approve each IoT and medical device in terms of cybersecurity before connecting them to the IT network. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamir. I was just plunged the mute button. I guess still in February 2021, the mute is still an issue. Our time is short, and I think we could further elaborate these questions for hours and hours. But unfortunately, I do want to wrap up to allow everyone to focus on their other activities today. So before we move onwards, I would just like to share that this is the first session of 2 sessions we are having on healthcare cybersecurity. The second session is going to be more industry oriented. It's going to take place next Wednesday at the same time. which will touch base on the topics that we focus on today: anti-ransomware, medical devices security, API security, and governance, risk, and compliance. And the sessions will be moderated by Dr. Saif Abed, an international expert in healthcare cybersecurity. So I urge all of our guests today also to register for this session as well. So to wrap up, I'd just like to thank our distinguished speakers for taking a break from their hectic schedules and joining us today, as well as taking an opportunity to acknowledge the important contribution of our speakers today for having our healthcare organizations more secured in these special times. I would like also to take the opportunity to thank the team who have made this event happen: Suzy Raitan, the cybersecurity lead at the Israeli Economic Mission to the UK, as well as Josh Cohen, the cybersecurity lead at the Israeli Economic Mission in Washington, DC. So I would like to conclude in the words of Stephen R. Convey: the key is not spending time, but in investing in it. So I do hope that our audience, for our audience, this was a well-spent hour. It was definitely well spent for me. So thank you very much and goodbye.